fellow fantasy readers, welcome back to my channel. My name is Kate. This is Diamond Painting and Dr. Pepper, and today I am back with our second week of the Way of Kings read-along. I want to thank you so much for your feedback on last week's video. I wasn't really sure how to start things off and how much to say, and your comments really encouraged me to kind of just go with what I'm feeling and try to be authentic to my experience of the book and my thoughts while I'm recounting it with you. I will still try not to be too long-winded, but I really appreciate you guys letting me know what works for you. So that said, let's jump right in. We're starting with chapter 7, and we're going through chapter 15 in this video. Just as a little reminder, this video will not be spoiler-free. We'll be going pretty in-depth with each of these chapters and what happens in them and my thoughts about them. So on chapter 7, we're back with Shallan as she is following after Yasna to try and convince her again to let her be Yasna's ward. She had overheard Yasna say she was headed to the Palladium, which, from what I can tell, is some kind of huge library in this city of Kharbranth. So she flags down a servant to start leading her there, and we get a little bit of insight into her thoughts as she's observing things on their way to the Palladium. She sees some Parshman servants, and she remembers how she used to really like speaking with the Parshman servants that her father owned back before he forbade her from speaking to them. So I thought that was interesting as to why her dad made her stop talking to the Parshman servants. And I'm wondering if this was around the time that the old king Gavilar was killed after he signed a treaty with the Parshendi, who are cousins to the Parshmen, or if this was before that, because that was about 5 years ago at this point in time. And it doesn't really specify when she was ordered to stop talking to the Parshmen. But then they get to the Vale, which is the room that's directly preceding the Palladium, and this is how it's described. Beyond the doors was a breathtakingly large room. The sides were of smooth rock and they stretched high. The dim illumination made it impossible to tell just how high, but she saw flickers of distant light. Set into the walls were dozens of small balconies, much like the private box seats of a theater. Soft light shone from many of these. The only sounds were turning pages and faint whispers. Shallan raised her safe hand to her breast, feeling dwarfed by the magnificent chamber. And then the servant goes on to tell her, "This room is called the Vale, that which comes before the Palladium itself. Both were here when the city was founded. Some think these chambers might have been cut by the Dawn Singers themselves." So they don't go into any more about the Dawn Singers at this time, but it makes me really curious who those could be that were here before this great city and creating these large rock rooms, and for what purpose they made them and what happened to them. Just more world building stuff that I love about this book. You get the feeling that there have been ages and ages gone by and that we're only seeing the tiniest tip of the iceberg as to what the history of this place is. Also, since we kind of mentioned Shallan's safe hand, I thought I'd bring that up real quick. It's really an interesting part of her religion, the Vorin religion to me, is that women's left hands are considered, I guess, vulgar to be shown to people in public. The right hand is fine, but the left hand is their safe hand, and they have to either cover it up with like a longer sleeve, or some people do a glove, but that's a little more risque. And later on, you'll see that the even more daring women or unashamed women will wear fingerless gloves on their safe hand. And it's an interesting, I don't know, kind of a commentary on religion and how sometimes there's these rules and they don't seem to really make sense. Like, why would one hand not be proper to show if the other one is a mirror of it, and that one's fine to show? And it's just an interesting commentary to me on following rules that don't seem to have a basis in anything tangible just because it's the rule. That's what I get out of it anyway. Also, while we're talking about the religious aspects of this book, they mention it a couple of times already up till now, but Yasna is actually a heretic because she is not part of the Voron religion. She's an atheist, and that is very unheard of for proper noble women in the time. But she is part of a powerful enough family. She has a high enough station that no one can really do anything about it. And I kind of love that for her. Anyway, Shallan can't afford to get into the actual library part itself because it costs a lot. It's part of how the city makes money. And so she instead asks to be led to one of the alcoves in this like rock room that's close to the alcove that's been set aside already for Yasna to come back to later. And as she's waiting for the servant to go check where Yasna's alcove is, she's kind of attacked by this flood of memories. She's thinking about how she's going to try to convince Yasna to take her on and how much it would mean to her family to go through with this plan, and how she has always felt like it says a piece of delicate crystalware locked in a cabinet to be displayed but never touched. And then she starts thinking about her parents, and we get this little memory here. It says, memories attacked her, Non-Balat bruised, his coat torn, a long silvery sword in her hand, sharp enough to cut stones as if they were water. No, Shallan thought, her back to the stone wall, clutching her satchel. No, don't think of the past. And this isn't the only time in this chapter that she specifically tells herself to stop thinking about the past. So it's pretty clear that she's been through some stuff and that it's bordering on dangerous for her to let her mind wander into those parts of her past. Also, I can't help but mention the wording about that sword that was sharp enough to cut stones as if they were water. Sounds like a little bit like something we talked about in week 1's video, and I'll leave it at that. So then she gets led to the alcove that's close to Yasna's alcove, and as an artist myself, I love Shallan, and I love this next part where it describes how she clears her mind by starting to work on some art pieces while she's waiting for Yasna to come back. And it describes her process and the way that she can kind of collect people or memories when she draws them. And I love this idea that like she takes this image of a scene in her mind, almost like she takes a mind picture, and then it's stuck there in her mind until she can get it drawn, and then it leaves her mind and goes onto the paper, and now it's part of her physical collection. And I just love that imagery. I used to read some books when I was a kid about a little girl detective. I think her name was Cam, and she had a photographic memory, and she could kind of take pictures of like a scene with her mind too. Like she'd actually say click and take a picture of the scene, and it always kind of reminds me of that. But I love that Shallan then removes that scene from her mind by drawing it, and then she has this physical representation of it, and it's no longer in her mind. It's almost like she has to draw, or her mind would become too full of all these things that she has seen and collected in there. This is one of my favorite quotes from this chapter. When she collected a memory of a person, she was snipping free a bud of their soul, and she cultivated and grew it on the page. Charcoal for sinew, paper pulp for bone, ink for blood, the paper's texture for skin. As she works on these drawings, she attracts creation spren, which are spren that can take different forms of things around them, and they're only attracted when a great artist is working or when someone's being especially creative. And I love thinking about these spren and how they're drawn by acts of creation and creativity. And we get another reference to the temper of her father here. As she is drawing these images, she's remembering how she used to collect and draw images of people when she was younger, and her father had gotten mad at her for drawing pictures of dark eyes, people with darker eyes who were of the lesser status in society. And it says it was one of the infrequent times he directed his infamous temper at his daughter. So just lots of indications that he was a pretty inflammatory person. So when she's done with her 3 drawings, including one of Yasna as she was turning that big boulder into stone from the last Shallan chapter, she decides the best way to try and convince Yasna again is to beseech her with logic, which I think is pretty brilliant because Yasna has shown that she is driven by logical thinking. So Shallan writes her a pretty dang well-written letter requesting that she reconsider and kind of explaining a little bit why she doesn't have more formal training and how that means that she's had to work twice as hard as maybe other people would have for every bit of knowledge that she has gained. And I think that's a pretty solid argument. But then she thinks about how she's not really there to actually learn from Yasna. She's there to steal from her, and the guilt almost makes her crumple up the letter. But then she hears Yasna coming, and so she leaves the letter and kind of prepares to jump up and make excuses for why she's there. But it turns out the person who shows up wasn't actually Yasna. It was one of the Ardents, which are kind of like, I guess, monks in the Vorin religion. They're actually owned by other people, which I think is interesting. But they can't have any belongings themselves. Anyway, this Ardent is in his early 20s, and he asks to wait with her because he has also been trying to gain an audience with Yasna and hasn't been successful yet. And then they have what to me is a pretty funny conversation where Shallan is trying to be all proper and respectful, and he's kind of teasing her about it and begging her to lighten up a little bit and threatening to dance on tables and stuff like that. And she's doing the anxious thing of imagining him losing his footing, dancing on a table, and falling off the balcony, which sounds like something I would be worried about if it were me. Shallan and I have a lot in common sometimes. So this Ardent capsule sees her artwork and is impressed and offers to lacquer the artwork for her, which she's hesitant because if it's done wrong, it can ruin the piece. And she doesn't usually let anyone else do it. But she is torn because she wants to show her respect for this Ardent. So she lets him do it, and he does it perfectly. Before much more time has passed, he decides to just ask Shallan to pass on a message to Yasna that he would like to see her instead of waiting for her any longer, and asks Shallan if there's anything Shallan is fond of so that he could maybe get it for her to thank her for passing along the message. She tells him she likes jam, and then he leaves. And Shallan's left thinking, why didn't he just wait for Yasna to return himself? And I'm wondering that too. It's like, why come and hang out for a little bit with Shallan and then scurry off when he could just wait? I don't know, maybe he had something else to do, but just an interesting little interaction, kind of fun between these two. Then Shallan has time to lacquer her other 2 drawings before Yasna does show up, and unfortunately doesn't look pleased. And that's the end of Chapter 7. Chapter 8 is another Shallan chapter, and at the beginning we get a very uncomfortable scene for people like me who are confrontation avoidant. Yasna takes one look at Shallan and says that she's wasted enough time on her and tells her in a very firm way that she does not want to see her again during her time in Kharbranth, and doesn't even give her the chance to present her letter, which the letter is still there in the alcove, but Shallan didn't get a chance to mention it at all before she apologizes and runs off and almost has a panic attack about the way she was just treated, and then has yet another kind of thought about her dad and how it made her very unsettled anytime anyone gets angry around her. And she kind of starts to have this panic attack and breakdown when a servant comes up and asks her to come back to Yasna. And kind of to her surprise, Yasna apologizes for her outburst and blames it on being tired and just a lot of strain on her lately. And then Shallan asks, well, what did you think of my letter? And it's discovered that Yasna didn't even see the letter as it's underneath a pile of books. So then she takes the time to read the letter and changes her mind due to the logic in the letter and says that she will allow Shallan to try again to be her ward after she's learned some of the specific things that her education is lacking. And that's something that she doesn't ever offer. So it's a pretty big boon for Shallan, but it also doesn't really help her because she needs the wardship right now so that she can go through with her plan to steal the Soulcaster to save her family. It says, Shallan's emotions sank. Yasna's offer was kindly, but it would take years of study to accomplish what she asked. House Devar would have fallen by then. Her family's lands divided among its creditors, her brothers and herself stripped of title and perhaps enslaved. So she goes back outside, kind of disheartened, and takes a minute to kind of lean against the wall, look out at the city, and think about what her family's next steps could be. And we get a little bit of insight about her brothers and the fact that one of her brothers had vanished over a year ago and that her father had proclaimed him dead and no one knows what happened to him. And then it says, as always, thinking of her father made her feel ill, and the pain started to constrict her chest. She raised her free hand to her head, suddenly overwhelmed by the weight of House Devar's situation, her part in it, and the secret she now carried hidden 10 heartbeats away. I love that she seems like such a young and inexperienced character, and yet she has all of these secrets and mysteries about her past that we don't know. I just find her really intriguing. Anyway, then she discovers that the sailor who had led her up to the palace is still there waiting for her, even though she had assumed he'd have gone back to the ship by then, but he decided to entertain himself gambling with some of the guards, and so he decides he will escort her back to the ship. And she talks about how she was denied wardship right now because she has to learn some more stuff. And Yalb the sailor is trying to convince her that she should try a third time to convince Yasna because, like, third time's the charm. And Shallan kind of hesitates to consider that with how kind Yasna was the second time after she apologized for being very rude. She offered her something that doesn't get offered to people. But then she thinks, well, I can't take her up on it later. So it's either try now or never get to do it at all. And then she thinks, well, what if I just get these books Yasna said and try to learn them while I'm here and then ask for wardship again? So she asks Yalb to take her to a local bookstore. And the next part with the bookstore is one of my favorite parts about the early chapters here, where Shallan goes in to buy these books that were recommended by Yasna to further her education, and it's going to take more money than she has left on her because these books are so expensive, and she's thinking about what she could put back. And then Yalb comes in pretending to be someone who works in one of the other bookstores and does a little ruse to make the bookstore owner think that Shallan has already been to other bookstores and gotten other price quotes, and it gets him to lower his price for her so that she can get the books she wants for a much, much cheaper amount that she can afford. I love Yalb in this scene. He's just so fun. So she takes her new books back to the Vale, finds an alcove where she can keep an eye on Yasna, but hopefully Yasna won't see her, and starts right into reading these books to get that knowledge that Yasna says she needs before she can apply to be a ward again. And before long, Yasna comes over and has seen her and was like, I'm not going to be rid of you ever, am I? And so she decides to just go ahead and take Shallan on as her ward. If she can't get rid of her, she might as well use her. So finally, Shallan has been successful in her goal to become Yasna's ward. Now we're on to chapter 9, which is a Kaladin chapter. And I wanted to take a moment to talk about the little blurb at the beginning of the chapter, because each chapter has one and I don't usually mention them, but I thought this one was interesting. It says, 10 people with shard blades alight, standing before a wall of black and white and red. And this is interesting to me just because of, if you remember the prelude, there were 10 members of this oath pact, and they left their swords standing in a circle, except for the 10th one who went back to that place of torture. And so I'm wondering if this particular blurb is talking about those 10, but it says collected 12 seconds pre-death, and that the subject was one of our own Ardents overheard during his last moments. So whoever is collecting these phrases from people who are about to die, it's someone who owns these Ardents, or it's Ardents and this Ardent was a member of the group. So that's a little bit of a clue for us, but it's not very definitive. Just thought it was interesting. So Kaladin has been going on these bridge runs, and everyone on his bridge crew keeps dying and being replaced with new slaves, and he keeps surviving, but he's getting more and more run down and less able to have any kind of hope. And the Spren Syl is observing this and asking him why he's not speaking anymore. And then Kaladin says this thing where, my father used to say that there are two kinds of people in the world. He said there are those who take lives and there are those who save lives. Syl frowned, cocking her head. This kind of conversation confused her. She wasn't good with abstractions. I used to think he was wrong. I thought there was a third group, people who kill in order to save. He shook his head. I was a fool. There is a third group, a big one, but it isn't what I thought. What group? She said, sitting down on his knee, brow scrunched up. The people who exist to be saved or to be killed. The group in the middle. The ones who can't do anything but die or be protected. The victims. That's all I am. Then he talks about how all of the members of Bridge 4, his bridge crew, only exist to be killed, and then says, if we're not dead already. So, he pretty much thinks he's in hell at this point. But his depression and hopelessness is kind of causing him to not be able to think things through as much as he once would have. It says the old Kaladin might have wondered why the armies didn't work harder to defend the bridges. There's something wrong here, a voice inside him said. You're missing part of the puzzle. They waste resources and bridgemen lives. They don't seem to care about pushing inward and assaulting the Parshendi. They just fight pitched battles on plateaus, then come back to the camps and celebrate. Why? Why? It says he ignores the voice because it belongs to the man he had been. And Syl notices this about him. She talks about how he used to be vibrant and people looked up to him, his squad of soldiers and the enemies he fought. And that kind of stirs something in him because He doesn't remember Syl being around until he was a slave in the caravan, in the wagon. But everything she just said makes it clear she's been watching him since he was back in the army, and he hadn't known her then. And yet, seeing him like he is now, Syl says she's gonna leave. "I'll try to come back," she said, "but I don't know what will happen when I leave you. Things are strange. I have odd memories. No, most of them aren't even memories. Instincts. One of those tells me that if I leave you, I might lose myself." "Then don't go," he said, growing terrified. "I have to," she said, cringing. "I can't watch this anymore. I'll try to return." Soon after that, Bridge 4 gets a new recruit who is a youth kind of the same age as Kaladin remembers Tien being, so of course he's reminded of Tien again. And then the boy dies at the very next bridge run, and Kaladin kind of breaks down that evening and cries for the first time in, it says, over 8 months, so I guess since he became a slave, he hasn't cried. And then we go into chapter 10, which is the very first flashback of the book. So this flashback takes place 10 years ago. So Cal is 10 at the time, and this is actually the flashback where we get the discussion between him and his father about how there are two types of people, the ones who kill or the ones who heal. And so I thought that was interesting to go from him thinking about that in the previous chapter to actually us getting to see that conversation and how he internalized, even at the time at 10, that there's that third group who take lives in order to save lives. So in this flashback, he's helping his dad as his dad does surgery on the hand of a local girl in their village and has to amputate one of the fingers. And they're kind of discussing whether or not fighters are needed or are a worthy pursuit. And Kaladin thinks, yes, they are. And his father, Lirin, says, you can't stop a storm by blowing harder, and you can't protect by killing. So I thought that was interesting. It's a very opinionated take for sure. I'm personally of the mind that sometimes in order to protect yourself or your family or someone else, you might have to cause harm, because otherwise, if you're an extreme pacifist and you just let people hurt you, then they're going to take advantage of that, right? So I don't know that I fully agree with Lirin here, but I also don't fully agree with 10-year-old Cal, who thinks it's honorable to fight for glory. But Lirin tries to steer Cal away from the thoughts of joining the army later by telling him that he has a talent with healing and that he wants to send Kaladin to Kharbranth when he turns 16 to learn how to be a real surgeon, which excites Cal a bit. And it kind of makes us wonder what happened, because obviously somehow Cal ends up in the army and not a surgeon, although it's clear from the previous chapters that he does have knowledge of healing. So we don't know if he was ever trained or anything like that, but he did end up fighting. So it turns out it looks like his father lost that argument, but we don't yet know the circumstances. We also find out in this little flashback that Tien is Kaladin's brother, and we know from previous chapters that he did die in the army and that Cal thinks he failed him somehow. So we're going to be finding out more about that later. So then we have chapter 11, and chapter 11 is a pretty rough one. Kaladin is feeling hopeless after Syl has left him, and the boy who just joined Bridge 4 died earlier that day. And he goes out and heads to the Honor Chasm, which is where bridgemen go to unalive themselves. I'm not 100% sure what I can say on YouTube, but Cal has decided this is the best choice left to him and one of the only choices he can make for himself. And so that's what he's going to do. He walks by his supervisor, Gaz, on the way, and Gaz tells him to leave his vest and shoes so that they don't have to go down into the chasm after them. So he drops those, and then he goes to the edge of the chasm, and he's about to step off, thinking about how his dad was right and that you can't stop a storm by blowing harder, and that everyone should become surgeons instead of soldiers. And he sticks his foot out and he's about to step off the side when he hears his name and sees Syl coming back toward him. And she seems to be carrying something, and when she gets to him and drops it in his hand, he realizes it's that poisonous plant that he was carrying with him when he was in the slave caravan that he was hoping to use to maybe try to escape and, hurt the slavers. And he asks kind of angrily why she brought that to him. And she responds, "I thought, well, you kept those other leaves so carefully. Then you lost them when you tried to help that man in the slave cages. I thought it would make you happy to have another one." So she brought him the leaf, not knowing it was a poisonous plant, only knowing that the last time he had one, before he'd accidentally crumbled it, he'd had a plan, he'd had a purpose, and he'd felt like there was hope. And she was just trying to bring that back to him. And later she says she went so far to find it and she almost lost herself. And the whole point of that journey was to try to find that so that she could bring him back to himself and make him have hope again. She wasn't ever planning to leave him forever. She was only trying to go find what she thought he needed to be himself again, which is so incredibly sweet. So then Cal asks why she cares, and she doesn't really know how to respond to that other than saying that he's always put other people's needs in front of his own and tried to protect the weakest members of the army back when he was in the army. And he says that he failed them despite how much he tried. He failed them anyway. And she responds that they would have died sooner if it wasn't for him, and that they felt like they were a part of a family because of what he did, and that that's got to count for something. And I don't think Kaladin looked at it that way before that moment. He just saw that no matter how much he tried, everyone he tried to help did eventually die anyway. So it didn't so much matter the difference he made before that if the destination was death either way. But then Syl suggests he could try to help the bridgemen. One more try, she says. And Kaladin's hesitant, and she's like, what more could you do to them? They're all destined for death anyway. So if Kaladin does try to help them, it's not like he can let them down. He can't do anything more to them. They're already at rock bottom. And that finally convinces him to come back around, and he heads off towards Gaz. And this part was so satisfying. He grabs him by the neck and it's like, look, I'm going to be the new bridge crew leader, and I'm going to start taking my wages, because before that he was using his wages to pay back his slave debt, but he's actually going to be collecting his wages, and Gaz is going to get a piece of those wages to kind of just leave him alone and let him do what he wants to do with the bridge crew. So he's basically bribing him, but he's like, you stay out of my way, you get money, and I do whatever I want with the bridge crew. And Gaz agrees. After that, Kaladin goes back to the quarters and he goes man to man and learns every single one of the names of his crew. Even if, some of them won't make it past the next day, he knows that names are important and he works to remember everybody's name. Perhaps he would break under the strain and give Amaram one final victory. But as he settled down on the ground to plan, he felt that tiny warmth burning steadily within him. It was the warmth of decisions made and purpose seized. It was responsibility. He would find a way to protect them. And that is the end of part 1 of the book. So congratulations, everyone who's reading along. And I actually think this video is getting kind of long for one video. We still have 3 interludes and 3 chapters, I think, after that to discuss. And I'm thinking this might be a good place to separate the video and do a part 1 and part 2. So I will post part 1 today and then part 2 tomorrow on Saturday. And then that way it's not so much of a big hunk all at once to get through. And also it gives me a little bit more time to record and edit for part 2. So I think that's what we're going to do. So thank you so much for listening to part 1. I hope you enjoyed it as much as last week. We're starting to get into some really interesting stuff in the book now. So it's really exciting. And I will see you guys tomorrow for part 2. Thanks, everyone. Bye.